What's up, everybody? I'm Dr. Sarah, the Hip Doc. I'm a doctor of physical therapy and run coach, and I love helping women runners with hip pain get back to running with confidence and comfort. And today I want to go over one thing that I think is the missing links for so many people's hips when it comes to their strength and stability program. Let's go ahead and get the first thing that I'm thinking about when a runner comes to me and they're like, Sarah, I'm able to run, but I want a better training program to make sure that my hip never goes back to how sore it was, or if they're like, my hip's kind of starting to get sore, this is the first filter that I'm putting it through. So I want to see, how does the hip move as it's moving in this plane of motion? So this is called the sagittal plane of motion. This is stuff like squatting, lunging, forward walking, running. I also want to see, how does the hip move in this lateral plane of motion? So this is stuff like abductions or lunging to the side with lateral lunges, different things like that. This is the missing link here. I also want to see how the hip moves and is feeling into rotation. So as it's pivoting like this is stuff like as we're pivoting over our leg, as we're doing things like hip airplanes, or as we're getting into and out of the car. I want to see what the hip looks like with rotation. Rotation is so important for the hip for two main reasons. Number one, I think it's commonly missed in a lot of training programs. Putting different pieces of rotation into a training program is kind of awkward. It's not as known about as things of like squats and deadlifts and lunges. Like, those are really easy, but rotation is something that is often missed. Now, this is why I think it's so important. So as the hip is moving into stuff like flexion and extension, or even abduction and adduction, there is a decent amount of available range of motion. But as it's moving into rotation, it is kind of a novel motion, and there is a decent amount of range of motion into rotation as well. Now, something more fascinating is if we look at the posterior hip, there is this group called the deep external rotators. So these are rotators that attach really deep into the hip, and these muscles are called our tonic muscles, or like our postural muscles. So these are muscles that actually work to suction and help stability of the hip. And you know, when they're targeted most with rotation. So if we are able to work on our hip being able to be nice and controlled through a large range of motion in rotation, we're actually working to increase the stability of our muscles. So then when we go into these big heavy ranges of motion, like we're back squatting or we're front squatting or we're doing like weighted lunges, we're actually having more active hip stability because we actually worked our deeper postural muscles with rotation. And then we're working some of our more big phasic muscles, which are like, big, huge muscles like our biceps or our quads or our glutes, that are actually activating more power into our hips. So I'd love to show you a couple exercises that I like to do for my clients to work on their rotation, work on their deep hip rotators, and work on their stability all at the same time. One of my favorite starting places for a rotational exercise is a hip pivot. So I'll actually have my client start with the weighted leg being the one that feels maybe less strong or less stable, and I'll have them pivot over that leg just like this. Two common compensations that I'll see is that they're dragging their leg with them. So they're just bringing that knee over as opposed to keeping the knee and hip nice and static and pivoting on this outer hip. The second one I'll see is they'll stand nice and straight and tall, and they're just kind of turning. This is actually putting the access of force into the anterior hip, which we don't want. We want it in the glute and in those rotators where they're able to tap out this way. This exercise I'll commonly call like the basketball pivot with my clients, because it really is like you're in that nice athletic position, you're tapping, you're pivoting, and you're almost pretending like you're like guarding as someone is coming to pass you. Whatever you do in basketball players, you'll get. If someone's doing great with the hip pivot, I'll actually progress them to potentially like a hip airplane. So the hip airplane is similar to the hip pivot. Well, I'll still have them be in that slightly bent position, but I'll actually have them come up into a T, similar to like a single leg deadlift. And then I'll have them rotate down and in, and then up and out. So we're still pivoting over that lateral aspect of the hip, getting those rotators to engage. If I switch legs and go from this way, you can see that my shoulder and my hip are nice and connected, and I'm really able, if I switch back, I'm really able to get a nice stretch through my rotators here, and then concentric work of my rotators here. I'll classically have people hold on to something so we can really get the glute rotators to work as opposed to having to work on balance, because if you try this one, you'll find it's quite challenging to balance. Lastly, if someone's doing excellent with the pivot and the hip airplane, I might progress them not in repetitions, but I'll progress them with the intensity of the exercise. So maybe I'll have them go back to the hip pivot, and now I'll have them do it faster. So instead of doing this nice and easy pivot where they're going like this, maybe I'll have them go quick, 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 pause, where I'm actually having them when they're in their most vulnerable range. So when they're in the most lengthened range of their hip, can they quickly pivot back and get back to that starting point? This is something that I like to do with runners because we're asking the muscles to work and recruit at a faster capacity, which is really needed as we're going into our runs. I feel like you would benefit from more rotational training, feel free to grab my free strength guide below. Of course, you can use the sets and reps. However, I love this guide because it gives you a couple more options of rotational exercises that work great to maintain hip health and strength. So feel free to check that in the caption below, and I'll see you next time.